The year is 2002. Halle Berry made a memorable speech after winning an Oscar. Justin and Britney break up before we find out how terrible Timberlake is. Murder on a Dance Floor was released off Sophie Ellis-Bextor's sophomore album, and a young child is watching a movie to help himself fall asleep. He puts a Disney VHS tape into a player. Little did he know the horrors that were to await him. It shows the year 1897, on a dark and foggy night in the streets of London. A young girl is playing with her father, a toy maker. There's a loud knock at the door. The father hides his daughter, and then the father is kidnapped to leave his daughter left in their broken home. Fucking what? So this is of course Basil the Great Mouse Detective, or just the Great Mouse Detective depending on where in the world you are. It was directed by Musker and Clements, the two directors who were in charge of all your favourite movies growing up, but of course before Disney had that renaissance. We start with this movie's version of Watson, which is Dawson coming back from what I believe is the war, which asks so many questions. Did these mice fight in wars with humans, or is this just a separate, different war involving mice? If they were with the human wars, is Watson committing war crimes in Africa right now? But none of that is important as we see Dawson hear crying of a girl down the alleyway. This is where we meet back up with Olivia, and this is the only time I'll mention her name, as God knows this movie says it enough times. Olivia seeks the help of the main character, Basil of 221B Baker Street. Now to explain the long convoluted reason for why he's called Basil. This movie is very, very loosely based off the Basil of Baker Street children's books written by Eve Titus, whose obvious influence is the Sherlock Holmes books from Arthur Conan Doyle. So starting with 1939, there were a series of Sherlock Holmes movies starring Basil Rathbone as Sherlock, so you can kind of get where the name comes from. But first and foremost, we are first introduced to Disney's excuse to put a racial stereotype in their movie, just like all their old movies. Now that we finally meet Basil, let's see what type of Sherlock he is. Is he A, the Basil Rathbone type? B, the Robert Downey Jr. type? C, the Benedict Cumberbatch Moffat type? Or D, the Will Ferrell type? Surprisingly, he's C, the Benedict Cumberbatch awfully written, knower of all, but at least with this one he's just a little bit more charisma not to be a total dick. Whilst Basil is monologuing, Olivia looks shocked as if she has any clue what he just said. And after another failed experiment, Basil retreats back to his violin and finally listens to Olivia about the horror show that was the start of this movie, and we get introduced to the actual main character, Ratigan. A villain created the only way Disney knows how, a campy, maniacal hit machine. And after berating his henchmen, we hit the best number of the movie. Even meaner, you made it, worse than the widows and... I thought a song like this must come from the same person that made the Renaissance film so memorable, Howard Ashman. But no, Ashman was too busy dealing with the Little Shop of Horrors at this time, so I went to look into actually who wrote the song. Composer Larry Grossman and lyricist Ellen Fitzhugh, who only worked together on one other thing, a musical called Grind. Okay, so I could only find one performance of this musical, and it was just the opening song performed at the Tonys, in which it was nominated for. So my only experience of this is re-listening to the album that was recorded. I still couldn't quite figure out if this show is like racist or at least problematic, as just from what I can tell from listening to it, the show is about a club or like a brothel or some kind. I imagine like the Moulin Rouge from Moulin Rouge during the Great Depression or something, and it's a huge ensemble cast with stories of from runaways to the owner of the club, but I couldn't find anything I thought would relate to the music in the film besides the basic fact that they're all essentially show tunes. Returning to Basil as he hatches a plan to use the best sniffer dog in all of London, a basset hound by the name of Toby, with an addiction to crumpets, but because this is an American production, they call them English muffins for some reason. Speaking of Disney, we see its rules continue for its hatred of dogs and not making them speak, even though every other animal in the movie can speak. Dogs can't. Toby gets the scent of Fidget, the horror bat we met at the start of this movie. Just didn't think it was relevant to say his name before this. Leading the gang to a toy store, which takes us to horror scene number 2, once again following this freak show of an animal. We see Fidget do what every curious boy has done and start stripping off the clothes of dolls before being interrupted by a large dog barking out the window. Basil gets another chance to show how much of a dickhead he is by proving the obvious thing to A, a child, and B, a moron. After pointing out the obvious, Basil and Dawson lose Olivia because you know one of them is an idiot. This leads to a jackass-style chase scene through the toy store with every attempt that Basil makes to try and catch up to Olivia. It's not Fidget, but Dawson that always trips Basil. Fidget escapes with Olivia as Basil and Dawson look defeated alone in the dark toy store. Basil somehow doesn't blame Dawson for his complete incompetence. Now back to the actual main character of the story, we see Ratigan walking in on Mr. Flaversham, also that's who Olivia's father is, working on Elon Musk's new sex toy, aka what every conspiracy theorist thinks the royal family is, aka the automaton of the mice Queen Victoria. After Flaversham's rebellion fails with threats of Olivia being harmed, the robot continues to be made. Whilst that is all happening, Basil and Dawson attempt to drown their sorrows by going to what would be the Victorian version of a gay club, with two of the most prolific things happening still to this day, furries and spiking drinks, and Dawson somehow falls for both of these things. Somehow Basil, who's meant to be able to blend in anywhere, is the one standing out the most, trying to do what's essentially a Nat 1 equivalent of a rough and tough accent.
2 points for me and my shipmate.
As Dawson is drugged and gets on stage with every furry's awakening, Basil tries to get any information he can, but fails only to luckily spot Fidget coming into the bar and speaking to the barmaid. Basil spots Fidget escaping and drags Dawson behind him to give chase, through what's essentially a Looney Tunes sketch through some piping, just to be baited into a trap by our main character, Ratigan. With this much fanfare and campiness I can only associate with later Disney movies, I am telling you this man was ahead of his times. With Basil and Dawson now in a mousetrap and Olivia trapped in a bottle, Ratigan leaves them to die with one last
goodbye so soon, and isn't this a crime?
Which is the exact same situation Disney was in real life. A segue is an uninterrupted. The year is 1980, and even before The Black Cauldron was released, animators thought it would be a waste of time and would rather go get a team to focus on their next film, which was decided to be based off the Basil and Baker Street books. And when I say based, I mean extremely loosely based, like literally the names of some of the characters, that's it, that it's based on, that's it. So, with the new project on the go, everyone is excited, they get a good cast of actors, they hire a 2-time Oscar-nominated singer for one of the songs. However, as the good gets going, the bad things begin, with the release date now pushed forward to be released in July of 1986, and not the initial time of Christmas in 1987, and with less than half of the budget of what The Black Cauldron had. Disney and just animation studios have a history of doing this constantly, but with a brand new animation crew and a new software to experiment with, it would have been hard to make the film in time provided they had a plan. Speaking of, Basil now must have an extra contrived way of escaping and letting everyone free all at once. Once again giving us the Sherlock style let me just chat shit and only make sense in my head kind of way. Ratigan's plan is falling into place with him and his henchman mouse-snapping the Queen Vic and replacing her with the robot Flaversham has been building all this time. See, I'm not crazy. It's subliminal messaging Disney was telling us years ago, and all our elected leaders of state are just robots being controlled by the elite. Why do you think they make government drones, aka pigeons, to spy on us? Crazy? I was crazy once. They locked me in a room, a rubber room with... With Ratigan now called out in front of all the people and Basil ruining his entire plan, Ratigan tries to make an escape as a riot breaks out in the court. Ratigan grabs Olivia and gives a very real threat.
Leave where you are, or the girl dies!
Which Basil chooses to completely ignore. Basil gives chase on a vehicle I could only say would come from animation as they all crash into Big Ben. Starting now my favourite scene of this movie, with the incredibly impressive animation for the time, and this type of animation technique led to how the Disney Renaissance movies were animated. Now comes the final fight scene between Basil and Ratigan, starting with Ratigan punting Olivia down into the clockwork, somehow surviving, then also almost dying again before Basil saves her, with Ratigan right behind them, and again I cannot express enough how awesome this actually is. Basil throws Olivia to Dawson as he's tackled down the clock face by Ratigan. And just like how Sherlock and Moriarty fell off the Reichenbach Falls, Basil and Ratigan both fall off the clock tower to their deaths. The rest of the heroes look on solemnly as they mourn the death of Basil. As we hear the squeaking of a bicycle, we see Basil yet again somehow moving on a vehicle which would not work. And that's how the movie ends, with our heroes now defeating the villain and Olivia's back with her father. Watson remains partners with Basil as we see a teaser for a sequel that never happens before the credits. And that's where we'll end here. Thank you very much for watching, like and subscribe, and I hope to see you guys for whatever video I make next.